So we look at this one, we see immediately, this one's going to be a little trickier. Not quite as clean as some of the other models that we've seen. Looks like there's a drag over here on the buckle aspect of that. Little bicuspid there. So I'm assuming that's a drag at this point. I'll look at it under higher magnification. We could see if the diamond marks are visible on that. Probably not. And looks like puffy gums here on the adjacent tooth. And it's subgingival and equigingival. Some drags and bubbles and stuff, so this one's going to take us some extra time. And another nice thing about this one, the reason this one's articulated, is because we're also doing the opposing arch, a molar on the opposing. So the good part is the teeth aren't opposing one another, because that gets to be a little bit more complicated. So we have that tooth up there, and we got this tooth back here, and so you don't have to worry about fitting them to one another. That's always a little additional complication, but easily handled once you figure out which way to go. And usually I start by just fitting one of them in. I like to usually fit those central grooves, and that usually works pretty well. If I begin with that, that's my main plan. So here's some of the complications we get with subgingival and equigingival preps. Increase our lighting here a little bit, and higher magnification, and we can see not going to be quite as much fun as we hoped when we woke up this morning. So you see the some contamination here, probably not gum tissue pulled over there, but probably some moisture stayed in there. Over here where it's rough is probably some just insufficient rinsing of the tooth before they took the impression. So that's what that little bubbly roughness looks like. A lot of times you'll see it on the adjacent teeth as well. Gotta watch out for these little drags on the adjacent, because we're fitting our tooth in next to that, and that'll mess with our shape a little bit. Get confusing later on if you're not noticing that. And there was some, the impression didn't go all the way up here, so there was lots of places where we got bubbles. Good part is we don't have to worry about those, because we're just working with the prep that we're actually working on. Now that looks like a drag to me, so it's got no texture to it. Probably just complete air inside the impression where that drag was. So we'll trim that off. Notice there's diamond marks on this adjacent tooth. So one of the doctors may have tried to improve the line of draw a little bit. May have been previous Dr. Prep or this latest one. So that adjacent tooth is hung over too far, it makes it really tough to clean up the embrasures. So it's probably done on purpose. It's usually not done accidentally. Somehow the doctors are able to do that without hitting the adjacent teeth most of the time. So tricky spot, here's a big old bubble. It's just pop right off most of the time. It's kind of weird how that works. And then the hard part here is going to be figuring out where the gums are in some of these other places. So we have to compare the texture on our prep to the texture of the gums. And also assume that most of the time it's going to be very natural curves to work with. So this little drag right here, so we can kind of trim that up. Sometimes if the fingers slip just a little bit, instead of refining that margin up, boop, they can pop in there and just lower that. But since this is a little higher here and a little higher there, it's probably again just a tiny little drag. It usually comes from just not rinsing and drying that tooth sufficiently. Or maybe they didn't get their impression material in there quickly enough after they rinsed and dried it. Get over here to this other area. And we're going to have to try to guess where the gums are, maybe if we're lucky. The impression material underneath that, and it'll chip away. Nice thing about working under high magnification is we can see all kinds of stuff that you don't get to see without it. Bad part is you got really limited range, focal distance there, so it's hard to see more than one tiny little spot at a time. So yeah, we'll say that's probably a moisture drag across there. We'll trim this really from two sides is what we do. Trim it from the other side. And maybe have a little better view. Where were we? We were on this side. This side where we maybe have a little better view heading that direction. So this is going to be a tricky one. You see, you can define a very tiny little edge with this 12B blade. And because it's quite stiff, as I mentioned before, I used to use an Explorer just to kind of define those. I would just come in and just define a line, say that's where my margin's going to be. But the Explorer would flex a lot when I did that, made it really tricky to get a nice smooth edge. So you just kind of follow. Can't really tell where that margin is. But if we go down here and look for impression material that came off inside the stone, and sometimes we can hunt them from the outside in. And that kind of connects up with this almost invisible little line right there. Curve over here. And since it would be very difficult to make a prep like this, I'm going to assume that that's a big old bubble in the impression. So not quite a drag, more like a bubble. Again, probably moisture trapped in there. This is an area where assistants can make it much easier for the doctor to have all the material ready to go, handy, so that the doctor can dry that tooth off and put the light body impression material on that prep immediately without any wasted motion or time. If they can get that in there in a couple of seconds after they rinse and dry, then they avoid a lot of those difficulties. So effective assisting makes it much easier, particularly in cases like this where you're doing upper and lower arch simultaneously instead of adjacent teeth. So I'm doing two opposing sections. So we'll try and trim that a little smoother. Fortunately, being a bicuspid, we can use maybe a little bulk out there. But if we try to fit our crown around a drag like that, then we end up with a huge, big, bulky gum line, and that doesn't work. It becomes a maintenance nightmare, an aesthetic nightmare, and maybe bother the patient's tongue. So we're going to have to use this same kind of technique most of the way around. Kind of sneak in from the outside, And find some impression material in a tiny little focus. Just kind of hunt our way around here. So I won't film the whole thing because this one's going to take a long time and you'll die of boredom. But that's kind of how that technique sort of works. You're going to sneak your way in there. This is a case where if you can scan this in the mouth, it's much easier because when you're doing intraoral scans, gum tissue looks totally different from tooth. At least again on my E4D, it looks very different. It looks darker. So even though it's shooting with a laser, it has just a darker look. It's much easier to tell what's what. So you can just look in there and go, oh, okay, there's tooth, there's gum. Plus you can tell right away when the patient's still there, oh, you know what, I need to do better isolation, or maybe I need to do a little laser troughing or a little E-surge troughing just to expose that margin a little bit better. Maybe I'll try placing another cord or a little bit more Hemidin or Stringident or something like that. So we're going to do that all the way around this one until we think we've found the margin all the way around. And then we'll do the other teeth.